Hey there, let me start with something that sounds cruel, but happens all the time. When the economy crashes, when markets fall apart, when headlines scream panic, some people quietly get richer. Not accidentally, not by luck, on purpose. Which feels wrong, right? Because crashes feel like disasters. Jobs disappear, savings shrink, fear spreads. So how on earth does anyone win during that? Let's meet Alice. Alice is doing everything right. She works, she saves, she invests a little. Her money is in the market. Then one morning she opens her phone and sees red. Lots of red. Her portfolio is down 20%. She feels sick. Alice thinks, I just lost years of progress. She wants to sell. She wants out. She wants the pain to stop. Now let's meet Bob. Bob sees the same crash. Same red numbers. Same headlines. Bob makes coffee. Bob is calm, which is weird because Bob isn't heartless. Bob just prepared differently. Here's the first uncomfortable truth. Crashes don't create winners. They reveal them because crashes are not random explosions. They're forced sales. When things go bad, people who need money have to sell. They don't sell because prices are attractive. They sell because they must. Bills, debt, margin calls, fear. And when lots of people are forced to sell at the same time, prices collapse. Not because the world suddenly became worthless, but because sellers are desperate and buyers disappear. Now here's where Bob comes in. Bob isn't desperate. Bob has cash, or access to cash, or patience. Bob is not forced to sell. So when everyone else is running for the exits, Bob is one of the few still standing. And that changes everything. Because price is not value. Price is what happens when emotion meets urgency. Value is what remains when emotion fades. Crashes are when price disconnects from value. Temporarily, Alice looks at her falling stock and thinks, this is dangerous. Bob looks at the same stock and thinks, this is on sale. Same chart, different situation. Now here's where the gap really opens. Bob isn't buying because he's brave. He's buying because he can. He doesn't need that money tomorrow. He doesn't need it next year. He can wait. Alice can't. Her savings feel fragile. Her income feels uncertain. So she protects herself. She sells. And that's rational. But it has consequences. Now let's zoom out. Crashes don't hurt everyone equally. They hurt people who are highly leveraged, living paycheck to paycheck, forced to sell at bad times. They benefit people who are liquid, patient, already wealthy enough to wait. This isn't about intelligence. It's about position. Now here's the next uncomfortable layer. Crashes reset ownership. When prices fall, assets move from weak hands to strong hands. From people who need money to people who have money. That's not a conspiracy. That's mechanics. Think of musical chairs. When the music stops, the people already sitting win. Crashes are the music stopping. Now let's talk about psychology. During a crash, fear dominates. Fear makes people sell good assets at bad prices. Fear doesn't care about fundamentals. It cares about survival. Bob understands this. He knows crashes are emotional events first and financial events second. So Bob doesn't ask, is the market scary? He asks, are the underlying businesses still useful? If the answer is yes, the crash is an opportunity. If the answer is no, then it's just destruction. Crashes separate the two. Now here's something that sounds backwards. Crashes are not when wealth is destroyed. They're when it's transferred. Yes, some value disappears, but much of it just changes hands. Alice sells at a loss. Bob buys at a discount. Years later, prices recover. Bob's gains are built on Alice's fear. Not because Bob is evil, but because Bob was positioned differently. Now let's talk about debt. This is where things get really sharp. People with debt are vulnerable during crashes. If you borrowed to invest and prices fall, you might be forced to sell. That's called liquidation. And liquidation doesn't care about long-term potential. It only cares about right now. Bob avoids this. He uses little or no leverage during crashes. Or he has access to cheap borrowing that doesn't get called in. That's a privilege. And it matters. Because crashes punish leverage and reward liquidity. Now, here's another detail people miss. After crashes, governments and central banks step in. They lower rates. They inject money. They stabilize systems. This helps asset prices recover. Who owns most assets? People like Bob. So recovery disproportionately benefits those who bought low. Again, position. Now Alice watches this happen. She sold near the bottom. She waited for things to feel safe. By the time it feels safe, prices are higher. So she buys back in. Higher. This cycle repeats. And after a few crashes, Alice feels like the market is rigged. In a way, it is. But not the way people think. It's rigged in favor of those who can survive volatility. Time is the advantage. Now here's the part that really stings. Bob doesn't cheer crashes publicly. That would be bad taste. But privately, Bob knows crashes are when wealth is built. But structurally. He buys assets that scared people away. He buys when pessimism peaks. He buys when headlines say never again. Because history shows something brutal and boring. Crashes are temporary. Human innovation isn't. Now let's pause. Does this mean crashes are good? No. They're painful. They're disruptive. They ruin lives. But within that pain, there's a redistribution mechanism. And it doesn't care about fairness. It cares about readiness. This is why crashes widen inequality. Not because the rich cause them every time, but because the rich are positioned to use them. Now here's the final piece for this part. Crashes reward people who think in decades, not days. Who measure wealth in ownership, not account balances. Who prepare for chaos before it arrives. Alice isn't wrong. Her fear is human. But Bob's calm isn't courage. It's preparation. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Crashes don't magically make people rich. They make the already prepared richer by transferring assets from those who need certainty to those who can tolerate uncertainty. And once you understand that, the crash itself stops being the mystery. The real question becomes why some people are always ready when it happens and others never seem to be. And that's where the story really starts to get interesting. And others never seem to be. Because being ready for a crash doesn't start when the crash starts. It starts years earlier. Bob didn't wake up one morning, see red charts, and suddenly become fearless. Bob prepared when things felt boring, when markets were calm, when nobody was talking about risk, when optimism felt permanent. That's when Bob did the unsexy stuff. He kept cash on hand. He avoided too much debt. He didn't chase every hot trend. He accepted lower returns in good times in exchange for survival in bad times. That trade-off is invisible during booms. It looks stupid. People laugh at Bob. Why so cautious? You're missing out. Just use leverage. And Bob nods. Because Bob knows something. Booms reward confidence. Crashes reward preparation. Now let's look at Alice again. Alice didn't do anything reckless. She followed the advice she heard everywhere. Invest consistently. Stay in the market. Don't time it. But here's the missing part no one emphasizes enough. Those rules only work if you're not forced to sell. Alice needed liquidity. Maybe she lost her job. Maybe expenses hit. Maybe fear overwhelmed her. The strategy broke down not because it was wrong, but because her life intervened. This is why crashes are not just financial events. They're personal ones. They hit people at their weakest moment. Bob understands this. That's why Bob builds buffers. Not because he expects crashes every year, but because he knows they're inevitable eventually. Now let's talk about something uncomfortable. The phrase buy the dip. It sounds simple, cute, confident. But buying the dip requires something rare. Not bravery, not intelligence. Spare resources. You can't buy the dip if you're trying to survive it. You can't act rationally if your rent depends on it. Bob can buy the dip because the dip doesn't threaten his lifestyle. Alice can't because it does. That's the gap. Now here's another layer people miss. Crashes don't just lower prices. They lower competition. Weaker companies fail. Over-leveraged players disappear. Speculators get wiped out. What's left? Stronger businesses. Cleaner balance sheets. Less noise. Bob loves this part. Because the recovery after a crash is often more powerful than the boom before it. Less clutter, more efficiency, And Bob bought ownership at the moment everyone else wanted out. Now let's talk about timing. Bob doesn't need to buy at the exact bottom. That's a myth. He buys when things are clearly broken, when pessimism is everywhere, when people say this time is different, when optimism feels embarrassing. Those moments are obvious emotionally, not mathematically. Bob isn't guessing. He's observing fear. Now here's the cruel twist. Alice sees Bob's success after the recovery. Years later, she thinks Bob got lucky. She didn't see the fear Bob endured, the headlines Bob ignored, the doubt Bob tolerated. Because patience looks like luck in hindsight. Now let's address a myth. Crashes don't make everyone rich who buys. They punish people who underestimate time. If Bob buys garbage assets, he loses too. The crash doesn't forgive bad judgment. It amplifies it. This is why preparation isn't just about cash. It's about understanding what you own. Bob doesn't buy random stuff. He buys assets with staying power. Things people still need after panic fades. Energy, infrastructure, core technology, essential services. Crashes separate needs from hype. Now let's talk about why this cycle keeps repeating. Humans are wired to extrapolate. Good times feel permanent. Bad times feel endless. So during booms, people overextend. During crashes, people overreact. Bob doesn't fight this. He uses it. He doesn't try to stop fear. He positions himself on the other side of it. Now here's the most uncomfortable realization. Crashes don't just make some people richer. They lock in inequality. Because every crash transfers assets from those who need stability to those who already have it. And each cycle compounds that advantage. Bob ends each crash with more ownership. Alice ends each crash with more caution. Over time, those paths diverge dramatically. Not because Alice is lazy, because the system rewards those who can endure volatility. Now here's the question people hate. Is that fair? That's not a market question. That's a social one. Markets don't care about fairness. They care about liquidity, risk, and time. And time is the most unfair variable of all, because some people are born with more of it. More margin, more safety, more room to wait. Crashes expose that. They don't create it. Now here's the important takeaway for anyone listening. You don't need to become Bob. You don't need to cheer crashes. You don't need to profit from pain. But you do need to understand the mechanism, because ignoring it makes you vulnerable. Understanding it lets you design your life to be less fragile, more resilient, more patient. That might mean keeping an emergency fund, avoiding forced selling, not over-leveraging, accepting slower gains in good times. Those choices don't look heroic. They don't make headlines. But they change how crashes affect you. And that's the real difference. Crashes don't reward genius. They reward survival. And survival favors those who planned when nothing seemed wrong. So, in conclusion, crashes make some people richer not because they're lucky or heartless, but because they're prepared, liquid, and able to wait when others can't. Crashes force people to sell under pressure, and that transfers assets from desperate hands to patient ones. The market doesn't reward fear or optimism. It rewards resilience, time, and positioning. If you want me to make other videos explaining these topics, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.